We're a national organization headquartered in Washington, D.C. We've been around for 100 years advocating on behalf of refugees and immigrants. We're in our Albany Field Office, opened in 2005, and we have affiliate organizations throughout the state as well that are independent organizations that also resettle refugees. So names like International Institute in Buffalo, and there's also some in Binghamton, New York, and New York City. And there are other agencies as well that resettle refugees. So really New York State is very diverse, and I want people to know that that's not only in New York City, but throughout the state and upstate region.
Well, you, as you indicated, were founded in 1911. Now, usually when organizations are founded, they're addressing a need. What was going on in the world at that particular time that they decided to create your organization?
You know, it's not something that I think about much, what was going on 100 years ago. I'm sure that, like now...
That was just before World War I.
Yeah, sure. So refugees, by definition, the 1951 definition, but certainly people were fleeing before that, is that people who are outside of their country of origin due to well-founded fear of persecution, which is also often entailing war, and that they've had their rights taken away. So really, they're being persecuted due to race, religion, national origin, or a social group they belong to. So,
what is the difference between an immigrant and a refugee?
So an immigrant is someone who is coming by choice. What I just described as a refugee certainly doesn't sound by choice. They're really running for their lives, and usually to an adjacent country, and then sometimes they get resettled. And an immigrant, more like our ancestors, many of our ancestors, came maybe for economic reasons. There might have also been political reasons. You know, sometimes the definition or the difference between an immigrant and a refugee is not so great. But refugees are given a certain status, and they're able to live and work in the U.S. from the day they arrive.
And they probably would have gone through Ellis Island all those years ago.
I suppose, you know, refugees come in many different ways. Sometimes they get to the other countries by boat, by land.
I was going to ask you that. How do the refugees end up leaving a country where there's persecution and end up getting into the United States? How do they make that journey? You know, it's got to be dangerous to leave your home.
It's a long and dangerous journey for many of them. We've heard stories of people, you know, on camelback through the Sudan. Oftentimes they're going through multiple countries, and once they flee, then they're somehow landing in a country that's safe enough and getting in touch with the UN. It's actually called the UNHCR. In overseas, and explaining their situation. Sometimes it can be an individual persecution. Sometimes it can be whole groups of people in places like Burma that have been under a militant government for a long time, or war. We're seeing a lot of Afghanis now coming, and Iraqis have been coming for years.
Who funds the refugees, getting them from the country that they're fleeing into the United States? It's not free.
It's not free, so that's an interesting thing. It's PRM is an arm of the State Department, the
what does that stand for?
Population, Refugees, and Migration.
Okay.
But the actual flight so they coordinate it with all of the places that they're resettled in the U.S., but the actual flight, so a family of 5 flying from a refugee camp in Thailand to New York State, you know, could ring up a bill of $8,000 or $10,000. That's actually a debt that the refugees arrive with. So they pay that off over time in small increments, but it is a debt that they're burdened with from when they first arrive.
Now, you said a lot of folks are fleeing Burma, and you said more people are leaving Burma than any other nation in the world right now because of persecution. What's going on there?
Yeah, I don't know if I'd say any other country in the world. I probably don't have all the data for that. We could find that online easily now. But certainly refugees in New York State, there's more coming from Burma, and I always say from Burma rather than Burmese, because there are many different tribes and languages in Burma, which of course is also called Myanmar. and it's been a militant government for a lot of years. Things have been looking maybe a little better lately with the freeing of Aung San Suu Kyi, and the refugees here from Burma are cautiously optimistic to see what goes on there. But there has been some movement in the right direction, and people have been able to go back and visit, if they're legally able to do that.
You were telling me the other day, too, that people are fleeing various African nations.
Yeah, certainly there are many civil wars that have gone on for a lot of years in places like Sudan and the Congo. And usually by the time refugees come to us, it's a little bit after things have been in the news. So, that's because of the resettlement process. They're fleeing to adjacent country. They hope that they can go back during peace times. Then when it's clear that doesn't happen, as a last resort, it's resettlement to a third country, when that's the only way to keep them safe. And just to give you a sense of how rare these folks are that make it here, less than 1% of the world's 14 million refugees ever get resettled. So I kind of think of them as the real survivors. Of course, there are many real survivors still stuck back in other countries. So
you said like 99% of those that don't get here, in other words, other than the 1%, they're like in a limbo. What kind of lives are they leading?
Yeah, it varies from place to place, and that's something I should say about refugees in New York State or anywhere else, that there's a wide spectrum. So some people have been living in refugee camps in places like Thailand, originally coming from Burma, and literally in tents. And they may have access to some kind of refugee schools. Other people, other end of the spectrum might be Iraqis who've been living middle-class lifestyles, some of them even being persecuted specifically because they were interpreters for the U.S. government. So not all refugees are created equal, but they do all come with really just a few suitcases. And I think that's part of the amazing thing, and how I'm honored to work with them, is that they're starting over, and the resilience and the motivation is just incredible. And I think it's something none of us can imagine if we had to suddenly go to another country completely different than our own and survive.
The U.S. Committee for Refugees and Immigrants helps people throughout the United States of America, but let's just focus on New York State today. Once these folks arrive in New York State, how do you guys help them?
So we have many different programs. Most of it is, and this is true for any resettlement agency, most of the efforts are focused on the first 30 to 90 days. So there's some basic funds available to help them find an apartment, get a job, get the kids enrolled in school, help them connect with an ESL class, health care, certainly getting them medical attention. Just so many needs when people first come. There's also a lot of culture shock that goes on. So needing to learn about the culture. Some situations might also be triggered in that shock of moving to another country. So medically or post-traumatic stress disorder. Just so many things that they need. Not unlike some of our immigrant ancestors, where someone needed to help them find a job and learn the language. But these are people that are also coming with a degree of trauma, depending on what the situations they've been in.
You were talking about our ancestors. I never recall my grandparents on both sides came from Ireland, surprise, surprise. And I never really heard them talk about it being a tough adjustment. I guess at that particular time they came here, there was some discrimination towards the Irish and the Italians, but it was only alluded to, but it seemed like it was a pretty smooth deal. Yeah,
I think, certainly they had less of a language challenge.
Certainly.
And
Faith Medora.
That's right. And that was a time when, you're right, people didn't talk about it. The focus was to assimilate as quickly as possible. And in their case, not having to learn a whole new language was easier, although I'm sure there's word differences and vocabulary they had to contend with. But I think the focus is also always on the next generations. So you're not wanting your kids and grandkids to hear about the hard times. You're just wanting them to live a new life. certainly the Irish famine, and it's no small thing, I think, to leave your country of origin, even by choice,
Sure.
and move to another place.
Now, folks that come to New York State that can't speak English, how do you help those people?
So it's certainly a challenge, and one of the things we're doing recently in the Albany area is getting a collaboration between the various providers of ESL. So BOCES and Literacy New York and a few other places that offer ESL, so that there's more of a coordinated effort. So that instead of going to 3 different classes and learning their name and address, they can, get more extensive vocabulary and things that will help them with their job search and supporting their family and adapting to the new culture.
I seem to recall you telling your story that we also have to adjust to their culture, because like if Mary Smith enrolls in a language class and it's time for her to go on a Tuesday night, the whole family says, well, we're going to join her, and all of a sudden, instead of Mary walking in, she's got 5 or 6 other family members with her. Did you tell me that?
I don't think I told you that, but it's not an unfamiliar story. So, yeah, it's certainly true that if you came and sat in our waiting room in Albany, it feels like the whole world walks through there every day, and you could hear 10 different languages in 10 minutes. So one of the things we're always teaching are about appointments, that it's not just a drop-in center like you might have in some country where you're standing in line until the doctor can see you, and if not that day, the next day. So there's a lot of adapting to the culture, and certainly we learn wonderful things from the refugees.
Were you telling me, I think, that you in your position when you interview people, in some cultures, because you're a person in authority, they're not supposed to look at the person of authority, so they won't look at you. Were you sharing that?
That's right. That's right. In the Karen tribe in particular, it's a sign of respect to look down. So if I were talking to you, I might be looking like this. So it's a little disconcerting for those of us that are used to eye contact,
Sure.
Signifying honesty and connection. So there's so many things that we don't realize are cultural that we do.
How about integrating the kids into the school system? Is that a challenge?
It is a challenge. I think we've been lucky throughout New York State in the schools being very welcoming and really valuing that diversity that having people from different nationalities bring. Certainly New York is one of the most, if not the most diverse state around. But there are challenges, and again, anywhere refugee resettlement is a partnership between the local community and the resettlement agency. So it involves the schools and the hospital providers and libraries, and everybody gets involved. We forget, but when you talk about the time of your grandparents, the Irish and the Italians, and all those things contributed to the culture we enjoy. We wouldn't have all the food choices we have. We just can't even imagine.
When one seeks employment, that has to be very difficult, especially if you can't speak English, or especially if you're not comfortable with the American culture.
So one of the most amazing things to me in this economy in the last few years is that we're able to find jobs for refugees every week. They come very motivated. We're told by employers they're very hard-working and focused. They show up, they do their job, they don't make waves, they stick at it a long time. Some employers have experienced much higher rates of retention, which of course is good for the bottom line. So, yes, it's a challenge, but we have job development staff that focus on developing relationships with employers, and then the refugees speak for themselves in the work that they do. The employers like to hire them again and again. And of course, I hear myself talking about refugees as if they're a homogeneous group. They couldn't be more diverse.
Sure.
Different levels of education and backgrounds and levels of trauma that they may or may not have experienced. But there does seem to be a vein of resilience and appreciation for freedoms that we take for granted.